The idea for the assassin came about a couple of years ago when we were trying to think up ideas that actually led into Hero at 30,000 feet, which is kind of the opposite thing. And I went to bed, we discussed the assassin idea, and I went to bed and thought, oh, can't we just do something nice? Do something nice with somebody for a change. So it led to Hero at 30,000 feet. But then when it got back into thinking of experiments, there was a bit, I didn't want to necessarily make them about positive personal journeys. I wanted them to be a little bit more detached. Then the idea of something that was a little darker in tone was more appropriate. So we went back to that idea. Historically, with hypnosis, there have been two schools of thought. There's been a group of people that say it is some special state of mind, a state that's different from normal waking state, in which something is qualitatively happening to the brain. And then there's another school of thought that's always said, well, it's just about behaviour, it's just kind of people, they're sort of playing along, it's just kind of about social pressure. And those two areas have kind of converged recently into, I think, a much more realistic area, which is something that's sort of between the two. And my approach to hypnosis had always been fairly sceptical, even though I do it all the time, in that I never thought you could make anybody do anything under hypnosis that they wouldn't be able to do in normal life. So with the ice bath, for example, in the show, my suspicion was, and the same of the two academics we had on the show, that somebody wouldn't really be able to stay in it for much longer than they would normally without hypnosis. But that maybe they'd think that they were they'd still feel that it was warmer, they'd feel less pain, but they'd still get out about the same time. And we were all surprised when Chris stayed in there for such a long time, and clearly could have just stayed in there for as long as he wanted to until his heart rate reached 50 ppm. So it was. That was an eye-opener for me. Equally with the throwing of the acid, we kind of imagined maybe two of them might throw the acid, but the other two wouldn't, and it was surprising. So I've sort of emerged from the show a little more open-minded to hypnosis being able to achieve things that you couldn't just through a sort of being having some incentive to play along. But I think it's also interesting and important to realise that the things that often look amazing under hypnosis are actually very everyday things. Like, for example, pain. You know, you cut your finger and you don't realise that it's hurting until you look down and see it's bleeding, and then suddenly it starts to hurt. Pain is a very subjective thing. So the guy in the ice bath is amazing, but at the same time it's quite an ordinary everyday process. And likewise, you can have people having surgery done on them under hypnosis, and they're fully wide awake and they're having their insides all messed around with, but the actual part of the skin that feels pain is very thin, and once you're inside the body, you wouldn't really feel pain anyway. So some things look more impressive than they are. They don't necessarily mean there's anything magical about hypnosis. People differ massively in terms of how well they respond to it, and I was looking for somebody in the show who was hyper-responsive to it. But if you, for example, I used to do a thing where I would make myself invisible. I think I probably did it in that show with the audience, although we didn't show everything. So if you had a room of people and I made myself invisible and I moved moved the chair around the room, and then you asked people afterwards what their experience really was, you'd have some people saying, oh, well, we could see you were just moving the chair, but I was kind of playing along. And then you have other people that would say, well, I knew you were moving it, but I couldn't accept it. I had to believe that it was moving on its own. I couldn't just accept that it was you. I was trying to sort of block you out all the time. Through to people that will say, I was just seeing a chair floating around, literally floating around the room, and it was terrifying. And that's one of the things that makes hypnosis very difficult to really pin down, because it's a very subjective thing. It's wildly different for different people. And are those people who are saying that they really saw the chair floating around, are they just still sort of playing along? Are they just wanting to appear like better subjects? So then you have to film them without them knowing they're being filmed, or record them out of a situation where they're talking to you, so they've got no reason to continue to play along, because if playing along as your model, then they could still be playing along. So yeah, there's clearly a wide range of experiences that makes it very difficult to pin down exactly what it's like. The traits I look out for with somebody are a kind of, it's an openness. It ties in largely with openness in everyday life, although you get some people that are very nervous and sort of rather shut off that are also very suggestible, so it doesn't quite hold up. But the sort of person that's, if I'm doing a show, I look for somebody who's sort of sat on the edge of their seat and sort of, kind of a bit wide-eyed, is a much better look than someone that's sort of sat there. If someone says, go on then, hypnotise me, I'd be fascinated to see if it would work. It probably won't. Whereas bizarrely, someone that says, "Oh, you could never hypnotise me, it would never work on me," actually probably would be quite suggestible, because there is still that emotional response to it. So those are the things I look for. And with Chris, one thing he had, when you watch the show, you kind of, in a nice way, he does have this feeling of being a bit of a blank slate. There's something kind of, sort of rather kind of, quite innocent and wide-eyed and slightly, a bit like a sort of, in a nice way, kind of an empty vessel. And I think that's very useful for somebody you want to be highly suggestible to carry out something like an assassination. Then he was ideal. I'm not a very good hypnotic subject myself. I'm more in that kind of range of people that don't respond too well to it. But I did have one experience, which was at a sort of, I was going to be a hypnotherapist at one point. So I went to a kind of a hypnosis course for a bit, which I didn't end up thinking much of it. I kind of left that bit behind. But I had one experience when I was doing a kind of a thing with somebody sat here and I'm sat next to them, and we close our eyes and we start to describe a scene together. So one of us says, I'm laying on a beach, and then you just have to kind of add bits. So the next person goes, "Oh, I can hear the waves," and I go, "I can feel the sand," and you kind of just keep adding details to this kind of joint scene that you're imagining. And I completely lost myself in it. When we came out, I'd been on the beach. That was the only experience I've had of really feeling that something shifted. Other than that, I'm just too analytical or whatever it is. I'm a terrible subject. Do I harbour a secret grudge? Yeah, against Stephen Fry. Nasty piece of work. No, he is the loveliest man in the world. I think anybody that would harbour any grudge or dislike him would have some sort of mental illness. He's lovely, which of course made it. I mean, it was very exciting that he agreed to do it, and B, it was kind of. I did wonder when he agreed whether he has this sort of awfully kind of overweening reputation of being a national treasure and all those things that must be kind of excruciating to be on the receiving end of. And I think maybe doing something a bit sort of edgy like this, I like to think it appealed, him playing a bit against type.